Most software engineers know how to keep their stuff up to date, but somehow most projects I've been working on still failed. And of course, there are various reasons for that, including management, but also beside the technical knowledge, something else was important, but I wasn't really sure what. And after a few years, I noticed that creativity is an important aspect of problem solving in software development.
Hey everyone, my name is Henry Suryawirawan, and you're listening to the Tech Lead Journal podcast, the show where I'll be bringing you the greatest technical leaders, practitioners, and thought leaders in the industry to discuss about their journey, ideas, and practices that we all can learn and apply to build a highly performing technical team and to make an impact in your personal work. So let's dive into our journal. Hello again to all of you, my listeners. Welcome to the Tech Lead Journal podcast, a podcast on technical leadership and excellence. If you haven't, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app to get notified for new episodes. Tech Lead Journal also provides bite-sized contents on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. My guest for today's episode is Wouter Groeneveld. He is a software engineer, computer science education researcher, and the author of The Creative Programmer. In this episode, Wouter dives deep into what makes good engineers truly exceptional, and that is creativity. He describes his definition of creativity and shares the 7 key dimensions of a creative programmer, from technical mastery to embracing constraints and being curious. Learn how you can take your coding to the next level and unleash your inner creativity as a software engineer. I hope you enjoy listening to this episode and learning a lot. Please share it with your colleagues, friends, and communities, and leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Let's go to my conversation with Wouter after some quick words from our sponsor. Hey, thank you for being part of the Tech Lead Journal community. This show wouldn't be the same without your ears, and you are the reason this show exists. Creating this podcast is a labor of love, but the truth is, it also takes time, resources, a whole lot of passion, and an extra bit of caffeine. So, if you're loving TLJ and want to see it keep on growing, consider becoming a patron at techleadjournal.dev/patron or buying me a coffee at techleadjournal.dev/coffee. Every little bit helps fuel the research, editing, and sleepless nights that go into making this show the best it can be. Thanks for being the best listeners any podcast could ask for. Hello guys, welcome back to another new episode of the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today I have with me Wouter Groeneveld. He's
Hi.
the author of a book titled The Creative Programmer. I think the title of the book sounds really interesting, programmer and creativity, right? I think we're going to learn about creativity as a programmer from Wouter and what aspects are really, really needed when we want to become a creative programmer. I think he even have like a trademark or even a term for this creative programmer. So welcome to the show, Wouter.
Thanks for having me. Welcome. Hi.
Wouter, I always love in the beginning to ask my guests to maybe first introduce yourself by telling about your highlights or turning points that we all can learn from.
Sure. So I am a software engineer. I've been developing software for 11 years in the industry. I've had plenty of experience. And after a few years, I've also picked up various roles like coaching and dev lead roles. And we started doing interviews, trying to get new people to join, people from colleges and universities, and also other more experienced developers. And while doing those interviews, I noticed that technicality or technical knowledge is usually not the kind of thing that's a big problem. Most software engineers know how to keep their stuff up to date, but somehow most projects I've been working on still failed. And of course, there are various reasons for that, including management, no pun intended, but also beside the technical knowledge, something else was important, but I wasn't really sure what. So we'll call these non-technical requirements for now. I know the term is a bit vague, but it'll get more concrete later on. And well, after 11 years of being in the industry, I've had the opportunity to teach half time at the university at my local faculty I'm currently working for. And after like a semester of teaching, I really liked doing that. And I was asking myself, perhaps I can really dig into the question I have, which is what makes a software engineer a really great software engineer, besides programming experience and besides knowing how to develop in Java or Kotlin or whatever. So for the past 5 years, I've been researching non-technical requirements in software engineering. So I've been a researcher now. I'm now an academic, so I'm what you might call a multi-class, a software engineer slash academic. And the combination of both is really interesting. And after a few years, I noticed that creativity is an important aspect of problem solving in software development. So we've focused and zoomed in on that. And the result is the creative programmer, I guess, and lots of other academic publications that are a little bit less fluent to read. So I guess we won't be doing that today.
Thank you for sharing your story. I always love reading this kind of book, right? A book that came from academia or
Yeah.
will, with the well-backed research, right? I think I have a few episodes, something like this. And it's always interesting and fascinating to actually understand maybe the human brain or the cognitive aspect of programming, right?
Hmm.
And I'm sure today we'll learn a lot as well. So you mentioned about, even though software programmers don't have any kind of technical problems generally, but software projects still fail, which you call the non-technical requirements.
Hmm.
So maybe if you can tell us a little bit more, in your view, what are some of the common challenges why software projects still fail?
Yeah, of course. Well, one of the most common issues, of course, is team-based, human-based problems when working in teams, when collaborating. There's lots of research based on that. This is one of the, let's say, challenges for me as a researcher myself, because I shouldn't let myself be biased by my prior experience. So I know the major problems, but as a researcher, I of course can't just say, okay, it's going to be this. That's anecdotal evidence. So we took that question and we went to the industry, to multiple companies from multiple countries, and we asked them, what do you think is the reason for that? Why are some software developers average and others great? And the result was a huge list of non-technical requirements. People were saying, okay, lots of communication-based skills are really important. Other people were saying you gotta really be good at constraint-based thinking. Other people were saying, no, it's gotta be creativity. If you have a problem, you need to think in a creative way to overcome the roadblock to be able to solve that problem better. So it's a really huge list of competences people think is important, and then we started ranking them. So that's another study that we executed, and within the top three was always someone always mentioned creativity, always. So that kept us thinking, that's interesting. Then we tried to see if there's already a lot of academic research within computing education regarding creativity, and the answer is no. So there's a lot of research in cognitive psychology related to creativity, but most of those results are really general. So it's not really programming, not concrete enough for a software engineer or developer to make use of, for instance. Let's call it that way. So what I try to do is to bridge the gap between cognitive psychology and the research within the creative field, and try to map it to computing education and see whether or not we can learn from that.
Sounds fascinating. So let's just dive deep into it, right? So you mentioned the creative programmer. So maybe tell us your definition first. What do you think is a creative programmer? I know this is probably a little bit generic as well for some people. Maybe we can clarify it.
Yeah, sure. So one of the, let's call it, classic definitions of creativity is something is creative when it's a high qualitative standard, when it's applicable to the context, and of course when it's original. So if someone else already made it, then it's not going to be creative because, well, it's already there. But this definition doesn't really take context into account. It's a classic one from the field of psychology, and we thought we could do better. So we asked people in the industry, what do you think is a creative programmer? Do you have any insights for us? And we basically summarized everyone's opinions, and we noticed lots of recurring themes. Let's call it themes. And the result is actually creativity is something within the context of programming, of course, is something multidimensional, which means that there's lots of different aspects involved in being a creative programmer. And each of those aspects is one chapter in the book of the creative programmer. So, one of the most obvious domains or aspects of being a creative programmer is having technical knowledge. In essence, it means imagine you're a Java developer. and you've never developed something in Java before, then chances are you're not going to be very creative at the reflective API because you simply don't know how to use it. So there's got to be a minimum, bare minimum level of technical knowledge to be able to approach problems in a creative way. So that's an obvious one. So that's technical knowledge. The next one is communication or collaboration, which is related to working together. It's more interesting, for instance, to work together in a heterogeneous group than in a homogeneous group because you have different opinions. And based on that, you can cross pollinate ideas and get a much better, more interesting idea. But of course, you need to be open to those ideas. Most people are not and and end up fighting. So that's not going to work. So that's the second one. The third one is an interesting one is constraint-based thinking. For instance, you have your typical time and money constraints. Something has to be done within 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. But within programming, of course, you also have hardware constraints. The stuff has to work on an older CPU because it's still deployed somewhere, or the banking industry says it's got to work in Pascal or in VB6, older software technologies that you have to work with. Of course, you want to use modern software development techniques, but it's an old tool. How do you do that? You also have to be creative to apply those new techniques to old technology. So that's the third one. Then we have critical thinking and a creative state of mind. So, what does that mean? Creative programmer is a critical thinker. That means you have different ideas, but you still need to critically evaluate each of these ideas to see whether or not they're applicable to what you're doing right now. For instance, which is really relevant today, if you ask ChatGPT for a question, it usually comes up with an answer that more or less works, or GitHub Copilot. Most of my students, well, I'm speaking, of course, about students right now, but most junior or some senior colleagues also do this, is they just copy paste the result because it's working and then move on. Sometimes that's good, but sometimes that's not. You first have to think about, wait, what am I doing? Perhaps these tools gave an answer that connects to something else in your brain that, if you think about it, makes an even better option. But you can't just skip that step. And then you have the creative state of mind, which is like the classic aha moments when you're showering and you're not really thinking about a big problem you have a lot of difficulty with. Suddenly, the ideas occur to you in a flash of insight. But before that flash, a lot of work has been done already. So most people think that it's some genius insight way that not everyone can achieve, but that's simply not the case. You've been chipping away at the problem for hours and hours and hours before you've got that insight. And there are a few practicalities that are explained in the book that can help you get more of those. And then the sixth is curiosity, getting out of your comfort zone. If you're not curious and you don't want to experience new things, you don't want to explore new technologies, then you're not going to make the link between the new thing and the old thing, which means that you're not going to have enough ideas to be creative as a developer. It's really simple. And last but not least, there are a few practical creative techniques that we can employ during programming to become a more creative programmer. One of those, of course, is a technique everyone uses and knows, zooming out. If you're really focused on a few methods you're writing and you don't know how to implement something, then perhaps it's a good idea to just zoom out for a few minutes and see, what am I doing? Is this relevant? And some people do that too often, some people don't do that at all. We have a few interesting techniques derived from, for instance, writers or artists that we can map to the world of software engineering to help become a more creative programmer. So that's in essence what it's all about. I know it's a lot. Perhaps we can pick out a few and discuss these to help the listener make sense of all this.
Thank you for the high level overview of the 7 different themes to become a creative programmer. So, one thing before we go into probably diving each of the themes when we have the time, but one thing that I also want to call out in your book, you mentioned something is creative when the social peers actually approve it. When I read that, I think it's also kind of like insightful, right? Because
Uh-huh.
it doesn't mean we always have to come up with something unique. I mean, like original, novel, and things like that. But something is creative is when our peers actually say, hey, that is a creative way
Yeah.
of doing things. Maybe this social verdict part you can touch on a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Creativity is a systemic, which means it's linked to other things like the 7 domains I just talked about. Creativity is not something like, for instance, I wrote a simple program in Java and I'm not creative because someone else has already written Hello World. Of course, millions of people have already done that, so I'm probably not going to be very creative at doing that. But that's not really the case, because if it was the first time for me and I've had a lot of difficulties coming up with that simple solution, perhaps it's for me personally, it can be creative. So, creativity, when you think about trying to define the concept, is really difficult because you have individual levels of creativity, you have team based levels of creativity, you have corporate based, like company based levels of creativity. And on the other hand, you have the context that's involved. Psychologists are moving from the classic definition that I mentioned earlier and are adopting a more systemic approach, which means that something is creative when someone else says it is, and that person who says it is the expert. For instance, if you're in a gallery and if you're looking at a painting, and if you don't know a lot about paintings like I do, but I still like looking at them, sometimes I wonder, should I be amazed? Should I say, oh, wow? Because with modern art, you don't really know. But if someone explains lots of things about the painting and the background, and you see that they think it's really creative, then you're not alone, and you're like, okay, yeah, this is gotta be creative. And that same principle also applies to the world of software engineering. But we shouldn't ignore the context, of course. Context is always relevant.
Right. Another thing that I just want you to also explain, right? People, as they go senior in the industry, maybe they learn a lot of programming languages, maybe they have done a lot of projects, maybe they went into different companies, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they are more creative than the junior. So this is also another important aspects that maybe we can learn as well.
Yeah, indeed. That's the difference between having 10 years of experience doing exactly the same thing, which means actually, yeah, you only have 1 year of experience because you just did the same thing over and over again. And someone else who did 10 years of different things, trying out different things, failing a lot, of course, because being a creative programmer inherently also means you're going to fail multiple times. But that doesn't mean that you're not learning anything. I think that's a really important takeaway if you want to be a creative programmer. You have to experiment. Like one of the concepts is, of course, also being curious. So that's indeed an important aspect of it.
Right. So let's go into the teams, right? So maybe we start from technical knowledge. Also, I just want to also give to listeners, right, how Walter explained these team in the book, right? You have a mix of, games. You also have a mix of philosophy or ancient history. I think that's always interesting for those of you who love these kind of topics, right? Because you can easily see what kind of problem that Walter is explaining for each of the team. So let's start with the technical knowledge, right?
Hmm.
I think you mentioned that, of course, if you want to be creative in Java kind of a software, you need to know Java. But maybe I want to touch on not on that aspect because that is kind of like given. Most people should
Sure.
should by now understand about that.
I hope
But
so.
I want to start maybe from getting inputs, right? Because in your book for technical knowledge, you advise us to actually get more inputs, which
Mhm.
means like learning more things, reading more stuffs, or maybe watching more tutorials or videos. So tell us more about the importance of this getting input.
Yeah, or for instance, listening to the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Well, that's really interesting because during one of our interviews, a participant said something like creativity is the brew of different inputs. And that kept me thinking for a while. I was thinking like, okay, that's a really good way to summarize a part of creativity, of course, because there are multiple parts involved. If you're only going to get input from one source or a few sources and you stick to those, then chances are that cross pollination of ideas is going to occur a lot less than if you have multiple ways to learn new different things. So it's really important to be open not only to the world of programming, but also read a few pieces on psychology, on philosophy. That's one of the things that I try to do with the book itself, is not approach it simply from the mind of a programmer, but also, like you mentioned, from different domains. And then you can see the ideas and the ways that people do stuff in those domains are not really that different compared to me as a programmer. And that's really interesting. But of course, there's also a big danger of having too much input, unable to process them, being paralyzed with too much stuff going on, especially with nowadays the internet, like social media, doom scrolling, keeping up to date. The conclusion is you gotta have a system. So one of my systems, but not necessarily the best one or the one you should employ, of course, is like having a curated RSS feed reader where you can paste in stuff that interests you. not having too much, but not having too little. So if you read those things combined with, of course, also offline books or ebooks or other things that you even hear on the streets passing by, like, this is something interesting, then you can start subconsciously, of course, cross pollinate those things. It's not something you do actively, at least not something I do actively.
Right. So I think when you mention RSS feeder and trying to constrain the input, I still have the problem. I subscribe to too many RSS feeders, I guess, and also newsletters. So I wonder how much time I have to actually consume all of them. So when you mentioned about this system, right? I think some people love this topic, personal knowledge management,
Right.
or maybe other people also call it second brain and
Hmm.
notes taking and things like that. And you have this loop, gather, internalize, act loop, right? So
Hmm.
which is very, very important when we want to actually use the knowledge, not just hoarding the information in the notes, but actually use that for something useful, right? So tell us about this personal knowledge management. I think because many creative programmers actually do this kind of stuff
Yeah.
quite disciplined.
Yeah, I noticed indeed a few ex-colleagues of me having things like personal wikis where they store technical information, or how to do a grep, or how to do regular expressions in Java or in Kotlin or whatever. For their next project, when they have to do it again, they can quickly reach for it and just apply the knowledge that they already have explored before. So that's an important part. But if you gotta store stuff, then you have to think, what am I going to do with it in the near future? So it's not just reading or consuming and then doing nothing with it. A creative programmer, of course, wants to be creative, wants to solve problems creatively, which means you have to do something with that input. Because, like you mentioned, there's just too much input, there's too many things to do and to read. You have to curate it and also add context. So summarize it in your own way. That's a really, really important part. Not just saving URLs or links to articles and then calling it a day. No, you have to summarize it yourself in your own words. When you're doing that, then during that process, you're probably linking it to something else. If that linking doesn't occur, then the cross pollination and the new ideas are not going to come. And of course, the ultimate goal of having a personal knowledge management system is having new ideas, capturing the new ideas, and doing something with it. Like Niklas Nuhlmann, a really well known German academic, used a principle called Zettelkasten technique. It's really popular lately. You can search for it on the internet or read about it in the book. One of the reasons why he did the thing that he did is to publish more. So I think Luhmann published like 60 or 70 books in his entire lifetime. That's not articles, that's books, which is huge. So that's the output. That's something, of course, as a programmer, you don't want to write books, you want to write codes, but the same principles apply.
Yeah, I think many programmers like myself, or maybe just let's call it technical or knowledge worker, right, actually
Right.
consume a lot of things, right? So
Hmm.
we read blogs, and these days there are so many resources, and not just in text, but also in audio, like this podcast, and also video on YouTube, and maybe even like short clips, like
Yeah.
YouTube Shorts
Yeah,
and
it's
TikTok.
crazy.
There's just so many information. I think the tendency for all of us still is like consume, but
Hmm.
we never actually take action on it. And in fact, for me, I also learned from, one of the podcasts before. I made it such a framework, like it's called 4 C's. So you first you consume a lot, but you have to create the second C,
Yeah.
and then you connect with people,
Yeah.
maybe create some kind of a network or maybe groups to actually share the creativity that you have. And the fourth one is actually to do it consistently. So
Mm.
I think that is also probably one thing that listeners can learn from. And you mentioned also creativity begets creativity, right? So once you create something creative, there might be a chance for you to create something more creative as well. So tell us more about this part, because I think it's also important to encourage people to start.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a simple concept. It just means the process of writing this book has been exactly that. It's been a process of, let's call it, fermenting of ideas for years and years. And I didn't really do anything with those ideas. So I've read a lot of different books, I've collected a lot of different articles, I've done a lot of studies myself. And somehow, after reading book after book, you start having these thoughts like, I've seen this before. Perhaps I should link this to something I've done before. Then, if you can hark back to the system that you have, you can quickly look up that information that has been contextualized by your own notes. Then you can link them together. And after doing that, writing the book itself is actually the easiest part. Well, in theory, let's say writing the outline of the book is is the simplest part, because that's just getting those notes out of your system, collecting them, rearranging them, and then some way or another, you already have a template of what you want to do, and then it's a matter of filling it in. And of course, I can work based on this book. I still have open ideas or questions I didn't have before writing them. Some of the chapters I can write some more fledged out examples for, or I've had ideas for future research based on what I've been writing. And if I wouldn't have written this, then I wouldn't have those ideas. So it's just a continuation of what you've been doing before.
Right. So I think the summary is like take notes, like gather this information, internalize that by doing summary for yourself, linking ideas, cross pollinate. I think you mentioned about
Yeah,
this word like so many times, right? Cross pollinate
it's
different
really
ideas.
important.
Yeah. And then the last one is take action, right? So you can't be creative if you don't produce or, do something about it, right? So I think
Mhm.
that is like a good summary. So let's move on to the next theme, which is the communication and collaboration. I think for many software engineers, this can become a challenge because, some are like more introverts, some prefer to speak to the machine rather than people. Some also don't like working in teams, they just want to go solo. So tell us more about this importance of collaboration.
Yeah, I think it's really obvious once you start looking beyond the boundaries of software engineering. If you look at really productive or really creative teams in the past, for instance, in art, like the gatherings in cafes in Paris, the Extreme Tuesday sessions in London, you always see the same pattern emerging, which is a heterogeneous group of like minded people who want to push a domain forward. They're fed up with, for instance, the camaradas in the 16th century. They were fed up with the current level of music and they wanted to create something new. So there has to be a common interest and there has to be people from different backgrounds because that's what makes it interesting. If you have an idea and you share it and someone else looks at it with different eyes from a different background, they can add value to it. And that makes the idea even better. But of course, you need to be open to do something like that. That's what I also mentioned earlier. And one of the most interesting parts, perhaps, of this chapter is that the idea of the community smells in the later part of the chapter, which means you have this concept called technical debt, which I guess everyone knows as a programmer, which is code that's been left alone that you should have refactored some way or another, which is going to cost money, which is the result of code smells, different code smells. And in community based teams, which are, of course, all teams, you can have something similar. Instead of technical debt, you have social debt, a concept called social debt. And instead of code smells, you have community smells. And why is that so important for a creative programmer? Because those community smells, they actually impede creativity. Not only at an individual level, because if you're unhappy in a team, you're not going to be that creative. I've read studies that claim that a happy programmer is a creative programmer, which is, well, I guess more or less true. But also team based, if there's lots of fights going on, or you know what I'm talking about, then at team-based level, it's not going to be that creative. So I think it's really important to try and identify those different community smells. For instance, we've all seen the lone wolf, which is a typical community smell. Is one guy in a corner typing away, ignoring everyone and just pushing git commit, hey, and it's done, completely ignoring the team-based rules. And of course, when that guy goes to home, the team is angry and has to revert a few things or has to modify a few things. That's not really a great way to form a real community. It's a team, but it's not a community, and it's not going to be really creative as a community that way. And there are different examples of community smells like that in the book. That's not a concept that I invented, but something that I encountered by the work of Damien Tambury, a professor in the Netherlands who has been working on empirical software engineering and also behavioral software engineering.
The moment that I read this part, right, the community smells and also the social debt, right, I think it's really, really insightful. Many people these days call out software engineering as a socio-technical problem, right? It's not only technical, but there
Yeah.
are social aspects that you also need to take care of. Just like what you mentioned, right? There are some anti-patterns in terms of behaviors or maybe teamwork, communications, right? You can also see if the team doesn't talk to each other. I think that's also another community smells, right? And I think the most important thing that you mentioned about this part is that you cannot be creative if you're doing it in isolation, right? Like you're doing it yourself.
Yeah.
So tell us, how can a team actually do something more together such that we can create more creative output? Maybe there are some things that you can advise us here.
Well, for teams, I think it's obvious that everyone should be open to the ideas of others, should be respectful to one another, even if you do not agree with the ideas or the implementation that someone else is trying to cram in. But one of the most important things, perhaps for engineering managers to take away, is to try to create a creative culture within the company, which means that sharing knowledge is also as important as getting the stuff done. Because if you don't share knowledge, not even within the team, but across different teams. And I'm not just talking about sharing the corporate knowledge or the functional knowledge of the software itself, but also more silly things like the personal knowledge management. For instance, if someone set up a wiki and they're having a blast, why not share that so someone else can perhaps also pick up that? If you somehow manage to combine different ideas or publish something, why not share that? It shouldn't always be work related. And I've seen in the past that that's a bit frowned upon. Most of the efforts for sharing knowledge are still safely within the context of the corporate software itself, and it shouldn't be.
Thanks for some of the tips. I think some techniques like, pair programming, mob programming is also quite useful,
For
right?
sure.
To cross pollinate ideas, learning maybe from seniors and juniors, right? And I think it's always a two-way thing. It's not just one way, right? I think that's also another key
Yeah.
thing. Let's move on to the third theme, which is constraints. I think this is for some people who know they can see it, but for most people who doesn't understand that constraints actually can also create more creativity. So tell us more about this concept that constraints can actually make us more creative.
Right. So most programmers usually get angry when they're given constraints. Let's just be honest. If someone says it's got to be done by the end of the week, then you're starting to sweat and you don't really want to continue at all. So there are different ways of applying constraints. Most of the constraints are just given to us, right? Like budget constraints, time constraints, hardware constraints, software constraints. If you end up in a team who's working in Go, then you gotta write software in Go, unless you manage to convince someone to write a microservice in another language. But that's just a constraint that's inherent to the program itself. But on the other hand, we have something called self imposed constraints, and that's perhaps the most interesting one. It can be viewed as follows: instead of having given constraints, you give yourself additional constraints. For instance, if you're stuck on a method or on a class or on a particular programming problem, you can say to your pair, why not try to write this in 5 lines or less? Or why not try to not use any loops, but try to use recursion instead, or the other way around? It forces us to view the problem from a different angle. And it forces us to rethink what we're actually doing. So these constraints that you impose yourself are really powerful. And in the beginning, you have to play around and try to see, am I pushing my luck? Am I doing it wrong? Am I adding too much constraint? Because that's also going to be a problem. There's something called a sweet spot of constraintness, which means if you have too little constraints, for instance, barely one or two, then the project is never going to be done. If there's no deadline and there's no money, you have an endless amount of money. Imagine. Then you're probably not really going to bother having anything done today or tomorrow or the week after that. You're just going to take a few years of vacation before getting started. But on the other hand, if someone says it's got to be done by tomorrow and you only have like a few €100 of budget, then that's next to impossible. So if you have too little constraints, you can add a few yourself. If you have too many constraints, you can try to imagine that you have less constraints. For instance, take some away, but of course, sometimes that's just impossible. So you have to imagine that. And by imagining that, you can also approach a problem in a different way. So that's a really interesting one. A silly example that we did in the past was, for instance, let's try to fix this without consulting the internet, without trying to look up anything. Some of the solutions then are probably not going to be very optimal, but then of course you look it up afterwards and you compare and you've learned something. The goal is always to learn something.
Yeah, I wish that we all can have this unlimited money, unlimited time,
Yeah,
and
I
then
do
we can
too.
just cruise along, yeah, and don't create anything. But I think what you mentioned, right, time and money are like the most common things that become a constraint, right? Because we work in a software projects or maybe like a competition with the industry, so we have to produce something fast and also cheap, right? And I think the other thing is scope, right? So sometimes we can tweak the kind of features that we have to build so that we can be more creative, like a focused kind of effort to solve the problem. And for me as well, doing this podcast, the time-based constraint really works for me because every week I have to produce something,
Yeah.
and that kind of like creates a lot more output for me.
Yeah, that's true. I do something similar actually for my blog at brainbaking.com. A bit of people luring there. I say to myself, I want to have something online every 4 or 5 days. And it doesn't really matter what. And most of the IDs I just plug from my personal knowledge management system. So I take notes, whatever I see or whatever I'm reading. And if I wouldn't have said that myself, there would be a lot less interesting articles, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it's not about the high quality of the content, right?
Yeah.
It's the act of just producing that I
Yeah.
think can improve the quality over the time. And yeah, just intermezzo as well. So Walter here is a professional baker as well. So if you're interested in learning how to bake, I think you can learn from Walter's blog. So the most important thing about this constraints theme for me is that don't forget there is another constraint, the self-imposed constraint, apart from the inherent constraint of the problem that you're working. So let's move on to the next one, which is critical thinking, right? So I think many people understand, yeah, we have to be critical, but what does it mean to be critical?
Well, you have different phases of the typical creative, inventive way of thinking. And most of the time, I think everyone is familiar with, for instance, brainstorming, right? When you're trying to brainstorm, you're trying to ideate, to generate different ideas of approaching a problem in a different way. There are, for example, 10 different ideas, and sometimes I've seen just people pick the idea that they have been implemented before because it's the easiest one, because they know it, because they've used the software or the technology before. Because of the constraints, if money or budget is tight, you of course do something that you've been doing before because then progress is faster. That's really simple. But perhaps it's not really the best way of picking the idea. Or perhaps if you chose the second ID, did you evaluate the other eight after that? Did you talk about those? Sometimes things like that get easily forgotten.
Yeah. So I think another thing that you can do in the team that I learned, right? You can do these things called spike, right? Be in your sprint, you allocate time to do spikes, learning new technologies, doing POCs and, sharing the findings, right? In a time box manner. The key is the time box manner. So I think critical thinking, some people also in the design thinking world, you have this, diverging thoughts and then converging thoughts. I think that's also probably one of the technique that is commonly used to be more critical, right?
Yeah.
And I think another important part is that sometimes you can do it in a team and sometimes you can do it individually, right? So maybe there are some techniques that you also have learned in the research that you did. How can we, improve our critical thinking mindset?
That's a really interesting one. It's kind of difficult to answer. I think the obvious answer is going to be that you have to try to be more critical each and every day, and something difficult you encounter, try to stand still for a moment and think, what am I doing right now? Should I be approaching this problem at all? Sometimes it's not problem solving or using creativity to overcome the problem, but sometimes it's problem defining. Is this problem the problem I'm trying to solve? Sometimes the answer is no. And not a lot of software developers ask these questions. Of course, again, under pressure, I completely understand you're not really going to do that at all. But it's not only on a low level, like when you're programming different functions, but also on a high level when you're approaching a client or when you're discussing something with a functional analyst. You always have to take these things into account. And it's a bit like putting on different hats, like the critical thinking hat, and then you have to ideate hat, coming up with different ideas. You can't do both at once, because if you try to do that, then you would have a lot less ideas, because you're shooting down the ideas as soon as they come into your mind, because you're saying, no, that's not going to be possible. No, this is costing too much. First, you have to ideate and not really evaluate whatever idea comes to mind. And then you critically evaluate the ideas. And because of that, brainstorming, the typical way that we do, is not really the best way to approach it. It's more interesting to brainstorm individually and to write something down, and then in group discuss and critically evaluate each idea, and not simply shoot down those. Because once someone starts blurting out ideas like, oh, I have this idea for that, someone else is bound to say, nah, not gonna happen. We don't have time. We don't have money. And of course, that person is not going to come up with another idea because they just been shut down. So you're shutting down the communication doing that. So that's not really the best way to approach things.
Yeah, so you mentioned this thing, right? I have another episode where they call this anchoring, right? So this is probably a community smell that people
Yeah,
have to be aware of, right? So in your group setup, right, in your brainstorming, maybe try to do individual sticky notes writing first, right? And let people put forth their ideas rather than, anchoring it to some seniors or maybe some people senior in the management level, right?
exactly.
So thanks for these insights. So maybe let's skip to the creative state of mind theme now. So I think this is also important because your environment, maybe your physical, right, also kind
Yeah.
of like have an effect to your creativity. So tell us more about this creative state of mind.
Well, that's when my previous experience and my current experience as a researcher really comes to mind. For instance, as a software developer before COVID, of course, I've been working in many open landscapes, which are typical, really loud environments where everyone is just doing different things. Multiple teams are put together in one giant open space because managers think, oh, that's bound to cross-pollinate ideas. That's a really good way to generate more more value or more ideas. And the opposite is true because nobody can concentrate and everyone is really shouting to each other and the volume keeps getting up and up and up. So that's not really the best way to approach things creatively. So open landscape, they just don't work. And that has been proven in academia before. There are multiple papers on this on the topic. That just doesn't work. But on the other hand, right now I'm sitting in a small concrete room. In academia, you have lots of small rooms where researchers work, usually alone, working at chipping away at a paper or at their research. And that's, of course, also not really the best way to approach things because if you individualize the work itself without really talking to each other, then again, the cross pollination, I'm going to keep on repeating that, is not going to happen either. So you have to somehow try to merge or marry those two things. Like if teams are working, leave them alone, put them in separate rooms, but try to find a way for people to bump into each other, right? Ideally, people from different fields, even. So, for instance, the MIT buildings have been redesigned to do exactly that, where the physicist can bump into a computer scientist or a psychologist, and then we could talk about the research they are doing. And perhaps someone is like, okay, that's an interesting thing that I can incorporate into my research. And then when they have to do the actual work themselves, the focus work instead of the diffuse work, then they can go to a quiet room with a few other people or by themselves to do the work itself without getting interruptions.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning about this open space layout. I don't know how it all started, right? I think maybe 10 years ago or something like that. All major companies start to
Yeah.
have this open office layout, right? And I think what you spoke is really true, right? Like we instead of getting more creative, I think there are a lot of distractions as well. Which I want to also bring to another topic. Instead of just the physical aspects, we also live in a electronic aspect, things like instant messaging, emails, and all the other interruptions that we have. So tell us more about the aspects of these virtual interruptions that can also affect our creative state of mind.
Yeah, when you're working, you have this creative state of mind or this flow of different thoughts that you're trying to somehow systemize or summarize into something that you're doing or trying to creatively overcome a problem. And then someone interrupts you, like someone else comes down next to your desk and asks a question, or you somehow feel the urge to grab your phone and start scrolling through Twitter, or no, I should say X right now. Things change so quickly that I'm unable to keep up. Interruptions are bound to occur, so you just can't avoid them. You can't avoid. Of course, a few things you can do yourself, like deleting your X account and trying to keep that cell phone away from the desk when you are actually doing the work itself. And also different focus tools like Pomodoro techniques or software that helps you reduce your screen time or disable your internet, things like that. These are simple things that sometimes can work. But still someone else might ask a question, come by asking a question. And then there's the principle of trying to store your current state of mind, the thoughts you are having, quickly write them down some way, either digitally or just with pen on paper, so that when the person leaves and the answer has been given, you can pick up where you left. And that's an important one that I see a lot of people having trouble with because after they're gone, they're like, oh, damn, what was I doing again? You have to take a deliberate effort to get back in that flow state. And it's been proven to take up to 30 minutes or even more. So before you alt up to your mailbox, try to remember that you're going to need 30 minutes again after that to get back into the groove of the work you've been doing. So that's not really what I'd call being very productive.
Yeah, if people love this topic, I think Cal Newport also have the book,
Exactly.
right, that can teach you
Flow.
some
Yeah.
insights how, yeah, how you can actually get in this creative of mind without being interrupted by instant messaging and emails, right? I think these two are probably the killers of productivity most of the time. And also another thing important is you mentioned we have to have well enough rest or sleep, in short, right? I think a lot of programmers, including myself, I'm like a night owl. I like to work at night and, like maybe sleep less. So tell us, like, from your research, what's this importance of sleep or well rested?
Yeah, it's related to something I said earlier that happy programmers are usually more creative programmers. And that also includes that well slept programmers are bound to be more productive and more happy in general, and also do more work more willingly and be more creative in general. So there's this psychological well being state that you also have to take it into account when being a creative programmer. I know it's really easy for me to say something like that. A lot of people have problems with that. It's usually not the employee, but the employer's fault. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think it also is related to trying to create a corporate culture where creativity is allowed. And that doesn't really mean creativity limited to the software that you're working with, but for instance, staring out of the window a few minutes to let your mind wander, to think about a few things subconsciously that you've been doing over the past few hours, and then just going back to work and coming up with a new idea or fresh head or something like that. Something like that is sometimes frowned upon, especially in my experience, my previous experience in the industry. For instance, there's a funny experience I've had is we worked really hard before noon trying to put out a fire in production, trying to fix a bug, and it took like 2:30 or something like that, so everyone was already finished eating and got back to work. And when it was finally done, then we also decided to take a little break, and we like to play a few rounds of cards when we are having a short break. And of course, just at that moment, the boss came along and saw us playing cards at 2:30 in the afternoon, and he was like, "What the hell are you doing?" But he didn't see us putting out the fire, of course. So our brain can't work 8 hours continuously. You have to take some time off, and that doesn't mean a few days off, but it can also mean a few moments, a few minutes, a few half hours, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And speaking about cross pollinating ideas, right? I think when you dream, I think it's also the most creative state of mind, especially if you touch on this REM sleep, right? I think I read this
Yeah.
book by Matthew Walker. I think that's also another way of you cross pollinating ideas in your sleep, right? I think maybe programmers, if you haven't got enough sleep, please try to sleep more. And let's go to the next theme, which is curiosity. One thing that I picked in this curiosity part, right? You mentioned curiosity and perseverance are the two most defining personality traits for creativity.
Mhm.
So be curious and persevere. So tell us more about the importance of those two.
Well, like mentioned before, if you're not curious, you're not going to pick up on new ideas because they just simply don't really interest you. And one of the really strange things I've seen my ex-colleagues say is like, "Oh, but I'm a .NET developer. I'm never going to do any Java." And I was like, what? The CLR is exactly the same as the GVM. They're constantly stealing IDs from each other, the world in Oracle and the world in Microsoft. Java and .NET are, or C Sharp are basically the same language used for the same corporate purpose. So why would you limit yourself to only learning something like that? And you can apply the same principle if you're a Java developer. Why not just take a look at some conferences which are focused on .NET? Perhaps they have talks about concurrency that you wouldn't really think about when you're doing your Java stuff. If you're not curious, you're simply not going to check them out, and then you're missing out on ideas. Of course, I completely understand that you have to divide your time somewhere and you can't really take a look at everything or learn everything. So, again, you got to choose your battles, is what I would say.
Yeah, and getting out of comfort zone, which you mentioned in the beginning as well, right? Sometimes, I mean, I don't know, like as we grow senior, sometimes we kind of like want to specialize a bit, and specialize in the kind of problems that we work with, the kind of technology that we work with. I think getting out of comfort zones from time to time, learning new technologies is always useful. So I won't cover the last part, creative techniques. For people who are interested in this conversation, maybe they can go and read the book. I think it's really, really insightful and interesting book for people who love this kind of topics. So I'll refer you to reading that book. Walter, thank you so much for explaining most of the themes, right?
Thanks
And
so
I have
much.
one last question for you, which is called the three technical leadership wisdom. This is something that I always love to ask my guests to share their wisdom so that we all can learn from you. Are there any wisdom that you want to share for us today?
I think the most important part is that we have seen students and also software engineers in the industry say things like, I am very creative, or say things like, I am not very creative. But they're not aware that creativity is a skill that can be learned. It's like a muscle. So it's just the same like learning to program. You can become more creative. Your creative potential can be increased by trying to look into these techniques and trying out a few different things like that. It's not just a simple matter of someone is more creative than the other one. It's something that can be learned. I think that's a really powerful and important message that we can try to pass along to the listeners. The second one, perhaps, is convince your manager to also read the book. Because I know the subject of the book is called The Creative Programmer, but it's less technical than you might be inclined to think at first sight. And it's that culture of being more creative is more important than you think. If some companies would be open to a few of those concepts and would encourage other people to be a little bit more creative, would employ more coaches to help them reach for those tools, then I think you as a software developer would be also a more happier software developer. And like we mentioned before, managers, you should know that happy programmers are creative and good programmers.
Right. Thanks for the plug. So, Walter, if people love this conversation, they want to learn more, is there a place where they can find you online, including your professional bakery blog?
Well, it's not really a professional bakery blog. It's a blog about any thought that I have, and I call myself a brain baker because I refuse to be a specialist. So yeah, you can find me there at brainbaking.com. I blog regularly, and I've been active on X/Twitter for years and years, so you can't find me on conventional social media. So the best way to reach out is just to go to my blog and contact me via email if you have any questions or insights.
Yeah. And also don't forget to buy the book and read the book. I've read it during my preparation. I think it's really, really insightful for me at least.
Thanks.
So you'll find some interesting ideas from the book as well. And don't forget, if you love games, right? I'm sure by reading the book, you'll be having nostalgic moment, like old games and things like that. I think that can also spark new ideas. So thanks again, Walter, for this time. Really learned a lot, and hopefully all programmers here can become more creative.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode and for staying right until the end. If you highly enjoyed it, I would appreciate if you share it with your friends and colleagues who you think would also benefit from listening to this episode. And if you're new to the podcast, make sure to subscribe and leave me your valuable review and feedback. It helps me a lot in order to grow this podcast better. You can also find the full show notes of this conversation on the episode page at techleadjournal.dev website, including the full transcript, interesting quotes and links to the resources mentioned from the conversation. And lastly, make sure to subscribe to the show's mailing list on techleadjournal.dev to get notified for any future episodes. Stay tuned for the next Tech Lead Journal episode, and until then, goodbye.